So with that, let's get started. As always, the presentation I'm going to share with you is going to be up as an attachment in that YouTube video that you saw. At the top of the hour, I'm going to break for questions. So if you are asking questions that you want me to answer that have to do with this specific class, please write them in the Q&A, not in the chat. I will not be looking at the chat during class. We also ask you to keep the personal chit chat in the chat to a minimum. That's also a good preview for today's class. At the top of the hour, in addition to answering questions, I'm going to talk to you about Cafe Oleh Conversations, which takes place on Mondays, 8 p.m. Israel time here on Zoom, as well as next week's class. With that, let's get started with today's class. So today's class, actually, we got to do in two. We have a lot to cover today. So the first part is, as I said, a different way of thinking about Hebrew. And I've shared some of these slides before. Not that one. Hopefully it's the right one. Yes, getting to the roots. It's just spelled in wrong title. Good. Live edit there. Getting to the roots. Okay. What do I mean by that? I've shared with this before. We're going to look at it a little differently today. Hebrew is a lot like seventh grade algebra. And sometimes people like to push back and say, no, Jay, it's addition. No, Jay, it's this or that. Let me explain. 392 of you on this call. We are the world's largest Hebrew class. Trust me when I teach this to you and just listen, and then maybe you can push back. It's a lot like seventh grade algebra. X times Y equals XY. X is the root. Y is what we call the form, and XY is the word. What does this mean? Every single word in the Hebrew language. Remember, we learn here modern Hebrew only. Modern Hebrew language, every noun, every adjective, and every verb has two parts, and only two parts, a root and a form. Next week, we're going to talk about the form. Today, we're talking about the root. The root in Hebrew is shoresh. It's literally the root, whether it's of a tree, of a plant, or whatever it may be, or your family roots, is a shoresh. Okay? Every shoresh in Hebrew, the vast majority of them have three letters. Some have two, some have four, but most of them are three letters. That is a unique characteristic, by the way, of all Semitic languages. And that root contains 50%, not just of the word, but 50% of the word's meaning. Okay, that's a really important distinction. It's not just it's 50% of the word, it's 50% of the word's meaning. If I know what the general meaning of a root is, I already know 50% of the words. Okay? So if this is seventh grade algebra, and I always show you this example where we take the root kaf, taf, bet, and we plug it into the different forms, we get different words, right? We're going to take a further step back. I'm going to illustrate this in, I think, a way that makes it even more easier to understand. Okay? What did I just say? That every Hebrew word, right, is comprised of a root, a shoresh, and a form. The forms change whether they are for verbs or for nouns and adjectives, right? So your root. It doesn't matter what color your root is. It doesn't matter how big your root is or how small your root is, right? They're all roots. And it doesn't matter what form you have. Some are rectangular, some are square, some are circular. We have different forms, okay? We actually have dozens and dozens and dozens of forms. We're going to talk about that next week. Right now, we're only talking about roots, okay? Once I know the meaning of a root, the general meaning of it, I know a lot of the meaning of the words. And roots can be plugged into these forms as often as you want. And each time you plug it in, you get a different word. So if it's plugged into a circular one versus a square one, rectangular one, a black one, white one, doesn't matter. You're creating a different word each time. The same root with the same general meaning plugged into a different form creates a different word. That's the basics of Hebrew. So that's to say, if you could understand, right? If you can understand Hebrew as a series of roots and forms put together, you can also learn the roots and forms individually. And that will give even greater meaning to words. What does this mean? Let me give you an example. as you saw here. Let's back up and look at some English first to show how, as opposed to English, in Hebrew, this is really important. Look at these 4 sentences. Some of them may make sense to you, some of them may not. She sang the song by the singer-songwriter. What is this sentence telling me? And more importantly, what are the words that are being used here? And why is Jay writing such a weird sentence? She sang the song by the singer-songwriter. I took the root, whatever we want to call the root in English language, because it doesn't work the same way as in Hebrew, right? And I plugged it in to 4 different ways of using it. Sang, song, singer, songwriter all have the same root. Okay? By virtue of being put in a different form, we create a different word with a slightly different meaning from one another, but they're all related because they all have to do with singing. The visitor visited during their visit. Okay, that doesn't sound so right. Right. It doesn't sound correct. Correct? In English, we don't speak like this. We have lots of other words, but we're often told not to speak like this. Just like we talked a few weeks ago, we're not supposed to speak in the passive voice. We're not supposed to use the same root in different formulations like this. But the visitor visited during their visit, the same root being used 3 different ways to convey the similar meaning of it. Advising the advisor is advisory. And my personal favorite, because this is how many languages communicate, the rain rained. Okay. Now in Hebrew, we don't say this, but in many other languages you do. The rain rained. It rained rain. Okay. It's actually it is raining rain here in Tel Aviv right now. Okay. What do all these sentences have to do with our topic today? First off, they're to show that as opposed to Hebrew, this doesn't work so well in English. First off, because we don't have roots that work nearly as mathematically pure as they do in Hebrew. And second, because these sentences are considered bad English, right? There are other ways to write these sentences that sound a lot better. But in Hebrew, we can write something like this. Okay. And if you can't read Hebrew, don't worry. All I need you to do for a few seconds is to look at this sentence and look at the words and notice what 3 letters, because remember what I said, a sholesh is typically 3 letters, what 3 letters keep repeating. Okay. If you said Aleph, Chaf, Lamed, you were correct. And if you don't know the names of those letters, that's also okay. You know which ones they look like, right? You see 3 letters that look exactly the same to each other, and they keep appearing in the same order. Sometimes there's different dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds under them. Sometimes there's a different helper letter in between some of the letters, but they always appear in the same sequential order. Okay, now if I were to read this sentence, it is going to sound like a tongue twister, and it kind of is a little bit. I had to practice a few times in advance of today's class, right? If I said this sentence out loud, hu he'echil et ha'ochel ha'achil lemi she'ochel. Or if I said it slower, hu he'echil et ha'ochel ha'achil lemi she'ochel. Okay. In Hebrew, it may sound weird, but this is a perfectly all right sentence. And what does it translate to? Well, first off, before we get to the translation, right? What did I say about those 3 letters? They all have the same root. Okay, and the root is Aleph Chaf Lamed. This is considered a root, shoresh. And typically, at least here at Cafe Oleh, I write it like this, right? With a period in between them. You'll also see them written in dictionaries like this, either with dashes in between the letters or our 2 favorite apostrophes between the second to last and last letters. Whenever you see it written like this will indicate to you that this is the root of the verb or the root of any word that you're using. Because in this sentence, we don't just have verbs, we also have adjectives and nouns. And we have our also favorite friend, the participle, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, but this sentence uses the same root again and again. And once I know the meaning of this root or the general meaning of this root, I can figure out this sentence once we plug in next week's class all about the forms that these roots are taking in this specific one. Let's break down this sentence. הוא האכיל את האוכל, האכיל למי שאוכל. Right? What does this translate to? Who is he, right? You see here Hebrew, transliteration on the right, English, and the part of speech on the far left. Hu he'echil. He'echil is the verb he fed. Okay? It is the causative form of the verb. We'll talk about that more next week, right? But he'echil, he fed. He fed et ha'ochel, the food, direct object, the food. Ochel is food. Ha'achil, the edible food. Achil is an adjective, edible. Lemi, to whomever. She'ochel is eating. Ochel is both the present tense of the verb to eat. It's also what we call a participle. And we've talked about participles before. Participles can be nouns, verbs, and adjectives, which is convenient because that's what we're focusing on. Okay, same root. One, two, three, four different ways it's used, but it's the same root each time. And once I look at the translation, the context which I'm using, I understand this word always has to do with food. Fed, the food, edible, meaning food that you can eat, eating. Those all have to do with food and the act of eating. Okay, so now I know anytime I see the root Aleph, Chaf, Lamed, I know to look for something that has to do with food or eating. It's that simple. It really is that simple in Hebrew. Okay, so now you have learned one root. Okay, Aleph, Chaf, Lamed will always have to do with food. Now I know 50% of the meaning of any word under the sun that has it, no matter if there's any of these dots or bars under the words, if there's a yud in between the second to last and last letters, or a vav between the first and second, it doesn't matter. If it's in that order, Aleph, Chaf, Lamed, it has to do with food. Let's look at another example. המכתבים הכתובים נכתבו בכתב על ידי הכתב. I was in the mood for tongue twisters, but again, there's no better way to prove and underscore the importance of this. Okay? What is the root of these words that keep sounding and looking alike? Kaf, taf, bet, right? המכתבים, הכתובים, נכתבו בכתב על ידי הכתב. All those words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right, have the same root, kaf, taf, bet. You saw at the beginning of our presentation, I skipped through it, and you'll be able to read it later. Kaf, taf, bet always has to do with writing. Okay, so even if I approach this sentence and I'm like, what is going on? I can always look for the root. And if I see words that keep repeating the root, I know something's up, and all those words are going to be related somehow. That's at the most rudimentary level of your Hebrew, folks. Okay? And then I have to figure out what the root is. Kaf, taf, bet in this case. Okay? Like we said, it can also be written like that. And let's diagram this sentence. Okay? המכתבים הכתובים נכתבו בכתב על ידי הכתב. המכתבים, the letters, like a letter that you would write to someone. הכתובים, that are written. We talked about passive voice a few weeks ago. This is the past participle. המכתבים הכתובים, the written letters, or the letters that are written. נכתבו, were written. This is the passive form of the simple verb, right? Niktevu were written, bichtav in script or in handwriting, al yedei by hakatav, the journalist. Again, letters, written, handwriting, journalist. They all have to do with writing. So anytime I see a word that has kaf, taf, bet, even if I don't know how to read the word, I don't recognize the word, I don't know the word, I know 50% of its meaning. It has to do with writing. Now, I'm going to pause here and say something that's good and not good. So far, I've explained to you a radical different way to think about learning Hebrew is by looking at the roots and next week looking at the forms rather than a rote memorization of it. And some books, some very few Hebrew textbooks do a good job of teaching you through a shoresh. I learned books that I learned like that as well. Not all of them do that. Some of them learn it by theme. Some of them learn it just by words they want you to do. Some are just alphabetical. Okay, but some have it by shoresh. Now, the good news is there are some of those books. The bad news is that's not the majority out there, and that's not the majority of dictionaries out there. That's not the majority of resources. And in fact, Hebrew is rarely taught, is rarely, not Israeli, is rarely taught through the roots. You may learn it in a thematic way, but you're not going to go from Aleph to Taf learning three-letter roots and sometimes two and four-letter roots, right? So where can you look for help? There are some dictionaries out there. The classic is the old school original dictionary by Eliezer ben Yehuda himself. Another great resource, which we share all the time here at Cafe Oleh and should be a regular bookmarked page on your computer or mobile device or whatever you use to watch us or learn Hebrew, is our good friend pe'alim.com. We've shared this a million times, so please don't come after me in the comments, folks, asking what is the URL for this. It's called pe'alim.com. We've shared it before, a great reason to go back to our previous lessons, including a whole lesson we did on online resources to help you with your Hebrew. It's a literal class. Go back, you'll get the link for this. Okay. But as you remember, this website lists everything by part of speech, how it's spelled, and by the shoresh. So if we look at all 9,207 entries here, you can see all of these words at the beginning have the shoresh, right? There's our word shoresh, aleph, daled, mem. All these words have aleph, daled, mem. Now, what words do we know? Two words probably most of you know with the root aleph, daled, mem. One of them is Adam, not just the name Adam. Adam also means a human. And Adom, red. That makes a lot of sense because if I start looking at these words that I have here, Odem, Adam Dam, Ademet, Adam, Adom, Adama, Lehadim, Odem, right? And then I look at the English, ruby, reddish, rubella, man, person, human being, red, earth, soil, ground, land, to become red, red color. Things are turning in your brains, I hope, right now, when you realize the connotation between the two. It's not by random mishap, right? The root will dictate half the meaning of the word. And that's why it shows how each of these words is listed. Look at it. Mila, right? That XY that I shared with you at the beginning, X, the shoresh, and the chelek diber, right? The part of speech it is, not only tells you what part of speech it is, shem etzem, noun, shem toar, adjective, poal, verb. It also then tells you mishkal ketel, Mishkal Kotel, Mishkal Ktaltal. That is what we're going to be learning next week, right? That's the form that the word, that the root takes in order to convey a specific meaning. Okay. So this incredible free resource online is also telling you, think of these words not as individual entries, but as parts of, as having two parts, a shoresh and this function here, which we're going to talk about next week. But if I go into each of these, I'm going to see the whole list of words. Let's go down. For example, if I keep going, ahav, aleph, het, he, bet. If I click on that shoresh, which is a hyperlink, and anywhere throughout this website it is, it's going to give me every word that's listed in this dictionary with the root aleph, he, bet. And we can already figure out what those words are. Lehov, to love. Lehitahev, to fall in love. Hitavut, infatuation. Ahava, love. Ahuv, beloved. Meuhav, in love with. Leheahev, to be loved. Right? All of these have to do with love. Aleph, He, Vav, when it's the shorsh of a word, you now know always has to do with love. And what you see, the differences in those words has to do with next week's class about the form. Okay, this week is just about the root. Shoresh and the form, which we talked about next week, the two parts of every Hebrew word. And that's where the difference of these come in as individual words, but they all have the same root, Aleph, He, Vav. Okay, Very important to understand all of Hebrew works like this. Let's go back to our presentation because we have a few more, and then I need to get you ready for our next big holiday here in Israel and around the world. Okay, right. So we talked about המכתבים הכתובים נכתבו בכתב על ידי הכתב. Now, a little bit of a warning, because as much as this is a very, very easy way to understand how Hebrew works, first off, I told you one challenge is that dictionaries don't make it so easy to look up a root. Old school ones do. Palim.com lets you do it. Everyday ones usually don't. Okay. The other thing you need to look out for are a few pesky letters that make understanding what the root is a little bit more difficult. Okay. This section, root consonants to watch carefully in conjugated verbs. You're going to understand what these four abbreviations mean in just a minute. And underword is a very important Hebrew saying or expression. That's always a good one to know. Doesn't have to necessarily do with our topic, but it's also a good refresher and practice. What are the roots of these two words? I'll give you a couple seconds. Okay, the roots are kaf bet dalet and chet shin dalet. Okay, kaf bet dalet has to do with honor, kavod, also weight. Kaved is heavy. Also, by the way, has to do with your liver. We'll get to that maybe some other day, why it has to do with your liver. Also, the word kaved. Chet shin daled has something to do with danger or suspicious or suspect or something that's fishy. So this expression, kabdehu vechashdehu, means to honor someone, but also suspect them, right? Um, and that is what we're talking about here, and that it's important to obviously understand and respect the rules of Hebrew. But these four letters that you're about to encounter have some issues, specifically Yud, Nun, Vav, and La, Hey. Okay, what am I talking about? First off, the letter Nun. We've talked about the letter Nun before. Is a very tricky letter because Nun, making the N sound, okay, may sound like the equivalent in English of the letter N. It's not. Why do I know that? Because there are many different ways that you can make this sound, and they all sound relatively correct or the same. That doesn't work in from one language to another. And I know this by the sound that's represented by the letter in the English alphabet R is a different sound than the letter represented in the Hebrew alphabet Rish. Okay. Nun is pronounced, as it says here, with the tip of your tongue on the ridge behind your front teeth. However, in English, we can say the letter N by flattening our tongue behind our front teeth. There are several other different ways to make that sound. That's all to say that how your mouth and tongue create sounds is integral to how words are created and how they're pronounced. And Hebrew is all about speaking comfortably. We want you to be comfortable when you speak. We want you to want to speak. Okay. So as a result, we have some letters that behave sometimes not so nicely. For example, the letter Nun. The letter Nun, when it's the first letter in a shoresh, um, acts a little funky. What do I mean by that? Take the verb to fall. In Hebrew, the verb to fall is lipol, but the root of lipol is nun pe lamed. So if I say I fall, ani nofel. I fell, ani nafalti. But in the future tense, it's ani epol. I will fall. How does it do that? Why it does that is a longer sentence, but it's all to say if we were to pronounce nun the way it's supposed to be pronounced nun in its regular form, it would act a little funky. Next week, like I said, we're going to talk about forms, and you're going to understand not only a little bit more why that's the case, but also um, how the heck, Jay, did you know what the roots were versus the form by just looking at these? Okay, we're going to talk about that a lot more next week. Okay. Aleph, Hey, and excuse me, Hey, Vav, and Yud also do the same thing. For example, in verbs like, as we have here, lehakim and laseget, and all sorts of other ones that you've probably been familiar with, right? The point, though, is that we always begin with the root. And once we figure out the root, and we can figure out by looking at resources like Palim.com what the general meaning of it is, we can start deducting what words mean. Okay? That's the first half of every Hebrew word is the root. Next week, we're going to talk about the form. Okay, Jay, I know 50% of the meaning because I figured out the root. Now, how do I actually create a word? How do I plug in? How do I know which of those dots and bars and vowels to put in and helper letters? That's going to be next week's class. We're going to pause here. We're going to continue next week with forms. And what I want to do right now is, as I just mentioned, talk about our next holiday coming up, which I need to pull up. Just 1 second. There we go. Okay. So, if it's going to let me, and as the rain is coming down, the rain is raining here in Tel Aviv. So, a hard change, but actually not so hard change between what we just talked about, the roots, what makes each word unique in Hebrew, to the next holiday coming up. And this is my annual rant about Hebrew and why Hebrew is so important and the meaning behind the upcoming holiday, which is not about 8 days of miracles. It is about about vanquishing our would-be vanquishers, our would-be dispatchers, who threatened to culturally and physically annihilate us off the face of the earth. Okay, the Seleucid Greeks in particular, in defeating them, taking over, and assimilating us into oblivion, into the pages of history. We celebrate on the holiday of Chanukah. Say it with me, folks. Chanukah. 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 If you say anything other than that, I don't care how you spell it in English transliteration, you're wrong. And how do I know that? In modern Hebrew, the word that I think many of you are used to hearing from other people, if not, maybe you've said it yourself a few times, Hanukkah is not the name of this holiday. It is the Hebrew word for breastfeeding, the act of breastfeeding. No less miraculous, but that is not the name of this holiday. The name of this holiday is Chanukah. Remember, we just talked about roots, and you see the roots written on the left-hand side. First off, these two words have very different roots. Hanukkah has the root Yud Nun Kaf, Kuf, excuse me, and Chanukah has the root Chet Nun Kaf. By knowing the other words that come with this root, which we're about to do, so we're going to plug in what we just learned into practical use. Okay, we understand not only are the words different, they're also pronounced differently. If you cannot say ch, okay, and I'm not going to get into a judgment base about that. Some people physically cannot say the letter chet, but I promise you, you all can, unless you have some physicality issues with it. Okay, you can at least make the sound oo, oo. That second vowel is oo. Okay, and once you pronounce it as oo, and then even better, put the emphasis on the last syllable, which is a hallmark of modern Hebrew, you'll say it correctly. Even if you can't say cha, if you say Hanukkah, you're still good to go. Even if you say Hanukkah, we're still good. Okay? But that second vowel is u. It is not There is no in modern Hebrew. We have a silent vowel that sounds sometimes a little bit like but that isn't the name of this holiday, folks. It's Chanukah. Chanukah. Okay? Anything else is not Hebrew. It's again another miraculous thing, but not this holiday. So let's look at some applications of this root, both that have to do with the holiday, but also in general, and it gives us some illumination into why this is the name of the holiday. First off, Chanukah, we learn means dedication or rededication, and we're going to look and see where that comes up in a little bit. When we talk about the centerpiece of what we do on this holiday, we're talking about a Chanukiah. We are not talking about a menorah. Those are two different things. A Chanukiah is a type of menorah, but a menorah is not necessarily a Chanukah. Okay, Chanukah has to have eight places for candles with one taller one called the shamash. Okay, that is a Chanukah. And that is the term that we use in Hebrew. We do not say menorah because in modern Hebrew, a menorah can also be an everyday lamp. Okay, you haven't explained yourself that maybe in other countries you can because Hebrew is not the dominant language. Excuse me. And even in Hebrew, it's incorrect. Chanukia is the thing that we use to hold the candles or forms of illumination that we light. Okay. Chanukat Bait. I just said that Chanukah means dedication or rededication. Chanukat Bait is the term that we use for a housewarming party. So if you move into a new apartment, if you buy an apartment, Chanukat Bait is when you bring in people and they come with housewarming gifts, right? But this root also gives us some interesting words. It gives us the word chinuch, an important Jewish value, education. If something is educational, it's chinuchi. You'll often find that many nouns can be turned into adjectives simply by putting the letter yud at the end. A chanich is someone who takes part in educational system. The pupil or the participant, the person who is learning, and the person who's teaching them is the mechanech. So remember those sentences where it sounded like a tongue twister? Look at all the words we can put together already that would talk about a high level subject, and they all use the same root. Chet, nun, chaf. Education, educational, pupil, educator. Right? I could make a sentence in the educational system, the educator imparts education onto the participant or onto the pupil. And I would be using that root multiple times in different forms. Okay, let's look at some other words that are related to how we talk about Chanukah and how it's celebrated here in Israel. We can't talk about Chanukah without Ol. Ol is light. And one of the many names of the holiday is Chag HaUrim or Chag Urim. Okay, Festival of Lights. And one of the common ways to wish someone a happy Chanukah, instead of just saying Chanukah Sameach, you can say Chag Urim Sameach. Many of the signage you'll see around Israel on buses, on storefronts will say Chag Urim Sameach, Happy Festival of Lights. Okay. Now let's talk about the Chanukiah itself, because it comes in many forms, some of which you may not be used to from where you are coming from. From where you're coming. First off is my personal, the one that I have at home. For those of you who go on tours of during Chanukah of neighborhoods throughout Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, you are going to be familiar now with a Beit Chanukiah. Beit Chanukiah is comprised of two words, Bait, house, and Chanukiah, the Chanukah menorah. Beit Chanukiah, it's also known in slang as as akvarium, which is not Hebrew. Aquarium is indeed an aquarium, right? Is a self-enclosed Chanukah menorah, meaning that it comes on a stand, usually metal, and it's surrounded on four sides by glass, and it has a top. And it's lit usually either with candles or with, as we'll see in a little bit, oil. And it's enclosed so it can also stand outside. It's not the traditional one that is completely exposed to the elements. This one is enclosed, so it can be put outside. One of the aspects of celebrating the holiday in the Talmud is what it's called in Aramaic, Persume de Nisa. Okay. Persume de Nisa sounds very much like Hebrew because it's our closest language and longtime friend Aramaic, but we have the same words in Hebrew. Persume, pirsum, denisa, shel hanes, the publication, the publicizing of the miracle of lights. Okay, and so the idea is that if it's in this Beit Chanukiah, you can put it outside. It won't get blown out by the wind as easily or even by the rain pouring down. Okay. On the far other spectrum of Chanukiot is a Chanukiat Pach. This comes from the word Chanukiah and Pach. Pach means a can. It doesn't mean a trash can unless you say Pach Eshpa. Eshpa is trash, refuse, litter. Pach is simply a can. Like a pachit is a can that you usually drink soda from, out of, right? Pach is simply a can, usually made out of metal. So a Chanukiat Pach are those very flimsy, disposable aluminum ones that many of you might have at home or are used to getting. Okay? Ner or nerot, candles. Ner is a masculine word, even though the plural is nerot, and you were usually taught that vav taf at the end of a word indicates feminine. It is ner, nerot, masculine word. Okay, so ner katan, a small candle. Okay, nerot ktanim, small candles. Part of a candle is a ptila, the wick. Ptilot are wicks. Shava is wax. That's not just in terms of candle wax, that can be wax in any sense of the use of it. And another common thing you'll find here in Israel is the use of olive oil, because that we're mimicking what happened during the temple being rededicated and so forth. The kosiot shemen zait. You'll often see this time of year rectangular boxes, cardboard boxes, or sometimes plastic containers that look like almost they should be containing eggs, but instead they're holding individually apportioned kosiot shemen zait. These little cups, kosiot shemen zait, of olive oil. Okay, and they come either mutzak, solid, or nuzli, liquid. This is what I use in my Beit Chanukah. Some people use these in regular Chanukiyot. It's a beautiful way to harken back to the tradition of olive oil being used in the temple to light the menorah there. And whether it's made with mutzak or nozli, the shemen zait makes it a little bit easier to transport. The ones I use are solid, so they won't drip all over the place and spill, which causes a huge and gross mess. You put it on, you light it just the same way. It's beautiful, and it holds all the same commandment obligations and so forth. Okay, we got through the Chanukiah and different kinds and what it's made of. Let's get to the food part, because that's no less important. Levivot. Levivot in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, in the modern state of Israel, is a huge family of what we would call fritters. If you know a little bit about Jewish history and specifically Jewish food history, you know that the original Levivot um, were cheese, in fact, were dairy. Okay, and there's a strong tradition of eating dairy on Chanukah. I'm not going to go into it right now, but just know that in general, what we would call in some other languages, potato pancakes or latkes, and we'll get to that in a second, are simply called levivot. And then you say levivot followed by whatever it's made out of. So if you want sweet potato um, pancakes, you would say levivot batata. If you want zucchini, levivot zucchini. Okay. If you want to be really specific about potato pancakes, levivot tapuchei adama. Or you can say latkes. Okay, and listen to how I say it, latkes. Remember that I told you there's no in modern Hebrew. That holds true, excuse me, even in loan words. And you see that ayin that's hanging out there, that indicates this word is Yiddish in origin, because Yiddish, being a Germanic language, but using the Hebrew alphabet, had to comp for the lack of letters in Hebrew that indicate vowel sounds. So Aleph became an A sound or an O sound, and Ayin became an S sound. So Latkes indicates to me not only is this word Yiddish, but that whatever it is of Eastern European origin. Latkes, potato pancakes, we would otherwise call, or latkes, right? The sound is not there. Latkes will be understood by the vast majority of Israelis. Okay? Very important, just as I talked to you about Chanukah versus Hanukkah, is to spell correctly and pronounce correctly. The word is latkes, folks, and it's spelled as I did up here. If you forget that ayin, you are spelling the word latex. Now, you do you, but just know there is a difference between potato pancakes and latex. For those of you who are team sour cream, it's a very easy word because it's a straight transliteration. Shamenet chamutza. Shamenet is cream. Chamutza, sour. Shamenet chamutza, sour cream. Okay. In Israel, we have multiple different fat levels. And if you are lucky enough to live near a Russian supermarket, they'll get even higher with the fat content. You'll kind of want those. If you are team applesauce, you should know not only the word for applesauce, but all the words that have the same root. First off, how do we say applesauce? Resek or mechit tapuchim. Notice we are not using the word for sauce in Hebrew, which is rotev. Okay? the word we use is either resek or machit. This has to do with the fact that the apples, even though they may look like a sauce, are actually smashed or mashed. Resek is a puree of sorts, and machit is usually something that is crushed. And the word for apple, tapuach. Okay, so resek or machit tapuchim, applesauce. That's how we say it in Hebrew. Apples give us a lot of other words, or the word tapuach, which also already appears in biblical Hebrew. Tapuach adama, which definitely does not appear in biblical Hebrew, as we have only known about it as Jews for the last 500 years. We were actually some of the first people to eat tapuche adama because when it was first brought over from the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, to Europe, it was considered poisonous food and only good for animals. Jews, being on the socioeconomic level they were at, were often given this as some of the first food to eat. And they realize it's a food powerhouse, right? We all know and love the tapuach adama, potato, literally apple of the earth, as many languages also call it, like in French, pomme de terre, so too in Hebrew, tapuach adama, apple of the earth. Apple, tapuach, adama, earth, oftentimes abbreviated like that, as opposed to an apple, which is a tapuach or tapuach etz, apple of the tree. Okay. And then finally, we've talked about this word many times. It's always just a good factoid to have for your Chanukah party to throw out when schmoozing, that the word for orange in Hebrew is not actually its own word, but it is also an abbreviation of tapuach zahav. Tapuach, apple, zahav, gold. Golden apple, again, like some languages call it, is the word for orange in Hebrew. It is not like all the other languages of the world that have usually two derivations. We call it in Hebrew tapuach zahav or simply tapuz. Putting together those two words, tapuz. And all of those, by the way, have the root taf pe chet. Okay. Interesting. What were other words in Hebrew have the root taf pe chet? I'll give you a clue. The next time you bake, that is your clue. Running out of time, so I want to be able to get through a bunch of these before I have to stop for questions, and then of course talk to you about Wednesday's class and next week's class. But the most popular thing to be eaten in Israel during Chanukah is not levivot, it is Sufganiyot. It is a great story about employing people during the winter months when there isn't as much agriculture. It is a great story of a commonality across Jewish communities, whether you're from Europe or North Africa or the Middle East or from wherever. And in Hebrew, there's Sufganiyot. Sufganiyot is also a great word because, as we talked about a few weeks ago, Hebrew words of non-Hebrew origin, Sufganiyot originally comes from Greek, just as the term in which we create Sufganiyot to fry, the verb to fry in Hebrew, letagen, is also a Greek word in origin. So if you think about it, we are also consuming our would-be destroyers in Chanukah. We are consuming the whatever you want to call it by eating Greek-derived terms. Anyways, sufganiyot, most popular thing. Everyone talks about what kind they're making, but before we get to what's in them, there are also a couple different derivations. First off, sfog is the word for sponge, again, originally coming from Greek, was where the word sponge also comes from in English, to its spongy texture, hopefully not soaking up oil. Sphinge is another kind of sufganiyas, particularly from Moroccan Jewish communities. Zdalabia is the same idea of taking a spongy dough and frying it. Usually think of it more like funnel cake. And another one that's very similar are buñuelos or bumuelos among Sephardic communities. To fry is litagen. Metuganim are the general family of fried foods in Hebrew. And then we get into all the different types of fillings you may have, from riba, jam, to creme, whatever it may be. But many people go all about the milui, the filling, which is related, of course, to the word miluim, reservists, which unfortunately we know all about in the last 2 years. All these having the same roots, as you see on the left-hand side. Okay. I'm going to let you read the rest of this spreadsheet along with the original presentation ahead of Wednesday's class. So if you are joining us for the first time on Monday, or you have just reconnected with Cafe Oleh. First off, welcome and welcome back. Wednesdays, we have Cafe Oleh Conversations, where we take Monday's class and we turn it into conversation starters that you're going to be broken up into small groups in breakout rooms here on Zoom, and you're going to be able to practice. I'm going to give you conversation starters. I'm going to give you topics to talk about, and you're going to practice at any level from beginner to advanced using the Hebrew that we brought up this week. So as you saw, we had two topics this week, roots of words and Chanukah. So now you know what Wednesday's class is going to be all about. If you sign up in advance, meaning at least 24 hours in advance of Wednesday's class at 8 p.m., you're going to get a reminder email that's going to have all the nuts and bolts that you need to participate, including conversation starters that you can practice in advance and get ready for, how we break you up into rooms, any questions you may have. I highly encourage all of you to join us on Wednesday. We have some people who come back week after week and love it. There are some people who have come back after a long time away. Highly encourage you to come because it's great to have 363 of you on this call, but Hebrew only works when you're given the chance to participate and communicate. So join us on Wednesday, a safe, non-recorded place, so you can make all the mistakes you want, because no better way to make to learn the language than by making mistakes. As I already alluded to, next week's class is going to be all about forms. We're going to review the forms for verbs, which we've already talked about a few times already, called the binyanim, literally buildings. And we're going to talk about the one that's probably the biggest one of them all that I guarantee you no one teaches, which is called mishkalim. Mishkalim means weights, not weights as in waiting for the bus, but as in weights and measures. And that's what comprises all the nouns and adjectives in the modern Hebrew language. We're going to learn about all of those next week. So you'll definitely want to join us next week, if not for Wednesday's class. With the time remaining, I'm going to answer some questions in the Q&A, only the ones related to the class. If I don't get to your question, please feel free to write to us at hebrew@nbn.org.il. And let me get started with the Q&A. And of course, I'll stop at the top of the hour to wish you all a bit. Can you offer strategies for reading transliterated words that are so often in Israeli newspapers? Yes, I can. I can offer you a strategy of going to our Cafe Oleh YouTube channel, because we have done at least 2 classes on transliterating from non-Hebrew languages into the Hebrew language. So we have a whole lesson on it. Um, each week I receive the link for the conversation class. If you have questions about technical stuff folks, Nefesh B'Nefesh, hebrew@nbn.org.il. Please write to them if you're having any technical issues, you're not getting your emails. Please check your spam. Please check your trash folders. They may be there all this time. What is the name of those 2 apostrophes? It's called Gilshaim. Okay. By the end of these lessons, will I know Hebrew fluently and confidently? No. I'm going to be completely honest about that. We don't claim to be an ulpan. We don't claim to be anything other than a supplement to whatever Hebrew you're hopefully learning in advance, or in addition to, or have learned or will be learning, right? But our focus here is on everyday Hebrew. So obviously in the course of an hour, we're not going to be able to teach you everything you need to do to be able to communicate effectively on the street. We're going to teach you topic by topic so that it builds up. And again, you have that YouTube directory that you can go back to and refer to things to get yourself prepared for a given scenario. What is the difference between an itonai and a katav, if they both mean journalist? The best way to understand them is that itonai, which comes from the word iton, newspaper, is more like a journalist. A katav is more like a reporter. What's the difference between a journalist and a reporter? I leave that to you. 2 advanced for me are their classes for beginners. All of our classes are meant for all levels. Just because this class was hard doesn't mean the next class is going to be less or more hard. I highly encourage you to watch everything, because again, this is about understanding Hebrew in an everyday situation. We have some classes that people tell me is way too easy. Great. We're trying to appeal to more than 300 people at once. Some of these are not going to be for everyone, and that's okay. Everything is up there on YouTube for your disposal, and it's a free class, folks. Even better. It sounds like you are putting equal stress on each of the syllables of Chanukah because I'm trying to emphasize the word. In Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, the default stress is always on the last syllable. Chanukah, Chanukah. But in trying to emphasize Chanukah, I'm going to say Chanukah. But in every day when I'm speaking to someone who I know speaks Hebrew, Chanukah. If aquarium is a Beit Chanukah, then what is an aquarium in Hebrew? Aquarium. It's a slang term, folks. Don't take it seriously. Aquarium is also an aquarium, but it's also the catch term because it is an enclosed glass cube, rectangular cube, rather. Uh, do you have the Chanukah spreadsheet link? Yes, you're going to get it in 24 hours on YouTube, along with the presentation that I showed you. How do you sign up for Wednesday? The link was shared in the chat, but you can also go to Nefesh Benefesh's website. It'll also be in the reminder email of our previous of all of Cafe Oleh to sign up, but you can always go to the Nefesh Benefesh website. I work on Wednesdays until 1:30. Can I join late? Unfortunately, you can't. We only have an hour together, and I try to put people in breakout rooms in the first after the first 10 minutes. So 30 minutes, you're going to have almost 15 minutes to practice. We really encourage you to come early on, and we start very on time. I know that's not very Israeli on our Wednesday classes. Someone just said that they learned Hebrew through roots. Guess what? Kol hakavod, as we say in Hebrew, you are doing a great job. That is not the reality of many people learning Hebrew, however. They're not learning roots and then the application of those into the words. They may learn the roots along the way, but they're not sitting there learning Aleph, Hey, Bet has something to do with love. Aleph, Gimel, Dalet has something to do with putting together. You're going to learn the roots along with words, but you are not learning them independently of one another. That's the difference here. Once you understand the power of a root and understanding then a word, which is not the order most people learn Hebrew, you're going to be light years ahead, which is what we tried to teach today. If someone's looking to get in touch with me, you're welcome to be in touch either through Nefesh B'Nefesh, Hebrew at nbn.org.il. You can also be in touch by my work email, j@hayati.com, hayyati.com. For very basic communication, if you have the shoresh, how critical is the form? 50%, folks. It's literally half the word. So yeah, it is important. We're going to talk about it next week. Lots of questions about joining for Wednesday, folks. If you didn't see the link either in the email for today or in the chat, please go to Nefesh B'Nefesh's website. The link is there. It's entirely free. Please join us. We would love to have you join us. Okay, with that, we are at the top of the hour. Again, Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. We remain the world's largest Hebrew class in no small part thanks to you showing up every week, sometimes even every other week, sometimes after months of being away. So Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. Please look on the YouTube's channel for all of our previous lessons. This lesson will go up in the next day or so, along with the two presentations you saw, the PowerPoint and the tables. We hope that you'll join us on Wednesday. And until then, I hope to see you all next week. And as we'll already be on the second candle next week, wishing you in advance a Chag Urim Sameach. Until then, lehitraot. Take care.